The topic for today, as I wrote you, it's a little hard to find sources. I'll just bring up something that I found on the computer. One moment. Last time I spoke a little bit about the Jewish reform movement in Europe and in the United States. And I would also like to talk about the Jewish conservative movement in the United States. You know, today when people talk about conservatives in the United States, they're talking about politics. They're talking about the Republicans versus the Democrats. This is very different. It's talking about reactions that happen in religious life in the United States at the end of the 19th century and in the first half of the 20th century and continued. So just wanted to point that out. It's a very specific idea. It's conservative with a capital C and not a small c, we would say in English. It's a specific conservative movement. So if you remember last time, and I'll show you this at the moment, I talked about that when the reform movement moved from Germany to the United States, through the medium of German Jews, actually, who came to the United States in the 19th century, it was a more radical movement than the one that was in Germany. And in the Pittsburgh platform, which I read part of it for you last time, which was the platform of the reform movement in 1885 in Pittsburgh. So I pointed out last time, had different decisions that they made. Or here, if you see, there's 7 different decisions that they make about the movement. And decision number 4, basically they are claiming that the mitzvot, the commandments of the Torah, are not binding on modern man. They're saying that the Mosaic and rabbinic laws regarding diet, for instance, kosher laws, laws of purity, laws of, dress, it's an easy one to talk about. They say basically it does not apply in our modern situation. So what the reform movement does at the end of the 19th century in the United States is basically break ties with traditional Judaism, in the sense that if in Germany the reform movement wanted to make compromises to stem the tide of assimilation, which was happening in the Jewish communities after the emancipation, the reform movement in the United States wants to create a new type of Judaism, one that will not have any of what they consider ceremonial laws, only ethical. Of course, you could argue if it's only ethical, then how is it a religious movement? I mean, we want people in general to be ethical. But this is the way the movement saw itself at the beginning of the 19th century. The ethical, let's say, ideas of the prophets, Judaism is there to inspire, but not as something which is binding, not as an obligation. And I guess they felt that this was also the way that they saw themselves in the new land, which maybe didn't tolerate people who had different points of view. I mentioned that the first synagogue built in Rhode Island in the 18th century in the United States did not write synagogue on it. They did not write Jewish center. They were nervous. It was a new country. They weren't sure how people would react to them. And on the bima, where the Torah was read, there was a trap door. You can still see it when you visit the synagogue today, the Touro Synagogue in Rhode Island. What is this? Oh yeah, And in the Touro Synagogue, there's a trap door in the bima where they would hide the books of the Torah just in case something would go wrong. So you can see that there today. By the way, in the synagogue where I teach in Tel Aviv, It's called the Beit El Synagogue. The rabbi there calls it the Tel Aviv International Synagogue. They have a Facebook, TAIS, whatever. That synagogue was built in 1930 in Tel Aviv, before the state. And the people in the synagogue were connected to the Jewish resistance against the British. And also the synagogue has a trap door where they read from the Torah, and it was a cache to store weapons in the resistance fight against the British. Yeah. So one has one reason, one has a very different reason. What country you are in. Yeah. Okay. What's this? Something already here? Okay, so you found something here, Nicoletta. Let's see what it is. Yes, the Pittsburgh platform. That's what I was just showing, exactly. Or something similar, yeah. Very good. So the reform movement, as I said, I think I also mentioned the first Jews to come to the United States were Jews who were originally from Portugal, Jews who went from Portugal to Holland, to Amsterdam. If you've been to Amsterdam, there's a very large Jewish Portuguese synagogue there, very large, what we call Sephardic synagogue, which was built in the 1600s. And for business reasons, they went to New Amsterdam, which was under Dutch influence, which eventually became New York. And these were the ones who built the Touro Synagogue, the first synagogue in the United States, built in 1772, which is 4 years before the United States became a country. I think I mentioned this last time. So the Reform movement had a very definite understanding of how it saw Jewish life in the 19th century. What changed the tide of things was the influx, the major immigration into the United States of Jews from Eastern Europe, from what was then called Russia, which included many countries. Russia was Russia, it was the Ukraine, it was Belarus, it was Lithuania, it was Latvia, it was Litva, it was parts of Poland. I mean, Russia was a very large empire at the time. We're talking about the end of the 19th century. I had 2 grandfathers who came to North America. Both of them had passports that said Russia. One of them came from the Crimea, and the other one came from Lithuania. But on their passports, it said Russia. So, yeah. Anyhow, so these empires, so you had Jews coming in from Eastern Europe en masse to the United States in large amounts. We're talking about from 1880 all the way to 1930, almost 80,000 Jews per year were coming to the shores of the United States until by 1930, what originally was maybe 150,000 Jews in the United States became 5 million. And then the United States closed their doors for Jewish immigration. That was 1930. Same thing happened in Canada. Jews went north, came into Canada, and Canada closed its doors in 1930 for Jewish immigration. The next Jewish immigration was going to be after the war, after 1945. In Canada, in fact, its doors were closed for immigration almost till the 1970s. First, they took in people after the war from all different places, and then they took in very few immigrants till the 1970s. Everything changed under the governments that took over in the 1980s and further. But immigration was very scarce in those times. It was difficult to get in. You had to be a mother's helper or something like that, doing menial labor. And then finally in the 80s, it started to change. And today, Canada is posting all the time, right? Looking for people. It's like everything changed since I was a kid. Even the areas that I grew up in, the demography is quite different. Okay, so Now, what happens is with these Jews who come in from Eastern Europe, these are Jews who did not really experience the emancipation. There was no emancipation in Eastern Europe and in Russia and Poland. Maybe in Poland, but much later. Poland actually, between the wars, was when it regained its. Remember, Poland only regained its independence after World War I. Right? Poland lost its independence to Russia and to Prussia as early as 1797. After the third partition of Poland, Poland only became an independent country again after World War I, after 1917. So Poland becomes a country from 1917 till about 1939, and then come the Germans, take it over. So it didn't really have a long time to regain its independence. Those were actually relatively good years for the Jews in Poland at the time, because Poland was fighting to create some type of normalized society during those years. And of course, it was stymied by the war. So the Jews that actually come in at the end of the 1990s, as I said, Russia, Poland, the Baltic countries, Belarus, and also Austro-Hungarian Empire. You also have Jews from the Austro-Hungarian Empire who are coming in also during that time. I had one great-grandmother who came from the Austro-Hungarian Empire. I don't know from where, because all it said on her passport was Austro-Hungarian Empire. So where exactly she was born, where she lived at the time, I don't know, but she did come to the United States somewhere in the late 1880s. That was, right. So, yeah, my uncle used to say she came from Austria, and he used to say to him, no, I don't think so. Especially since she didn't speak German. So she could have come from Transylvania, she could have been from Hungary, she could have been from Slovakia, it could have been, yeah, lots of possibilities. Anyhow, the Jews who came to the United States in huge waves from the 1880s, number one, they had to prove that they could speak a language, because there was a law in the United States. If you did not speak an official language, you were not accepted. Now, all the Jews spoke Yiddish, and Yiddish was not recognized as an official language. So there were two organizations. One was called the Hebrew Immigrant Society, which turned to the government and said, we will prove to you that Yiddish is a real language, because these people speak and they write and they read in Yiddish. And also there was the Hebrew Immigration Society, the Jewish Immigration Society. Both of them petitioned the courts, and eventually it was recognized. And that was the time. And then in the 1920s or 1915 approximately, Oriel Weinreich wrote his book College Yiddish to prove that Yiddish is a real language, with grammar, with text, with writings, etc. And I guess you might say that the best expression of that is the fact that a Nobel Prize eventually was given to a Yiddish writer. So that's probably the best expression.
May I say something?
Yes, of course.
In 1932, they made the first Yiddish movie, Uncle Moses.
Where was this?
In America.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, yeah, something like that. Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah,
It's
there were
Yiddish.
some Yiddish movies. You can actually
Exactly.
get them.
Yeah. Very interesting movie.
Yeah, interesting. In fact, you know that in the 1930s, the Barry sisters, who were Jewish American singers and sang Yiddish songs, they had a Yiddish song which was called Bei mir bist du schön, which became a very popular song in Germany in the 1930s, because it sounds like German and it came from the United States, right? So even under the Nazi government, which starts in 1933, these Barry sisters, their songs were quite popular in Germany at the time. And Those were, of course, better times. Laura, you want to say something? Somebody raised a hand.
No, it was applause for
Oh,
Nicoletta
okay,
because
okay, very good.
she knew.
You can find the Barry sisters on YouTube. Yeah, it's interesting to hear the old style of singing from the 1920s and 1930s. So the United States now changes. As I said, you had the Sephardic Portuguese Jews in the 18th century. You have the German Jews who come in the 19th century, and then come the Eastern European Jews, what the Germans called the Ostjuden, the Jews from the East, okay? And it's really a whole different type of Jew. First of all, they are traditionalists. Many of them come from the Pale of Settlement where Jews were allowed to live. Even if they came from areas like Poland, Ukraine, or Transylvania, they lived in little Jewish towns, what we call in Yiddish a shtetl, where a large part of their small communities were Jewish. They did not necessarily have the ability to go to university, so they did not. Most of them understood Hebrew for the prayers and knew the prayers and knew how to read Hebrew from the Torah and from the prayer book, but not much more than that. And because the rabbis of Eastern Europe were afraid that the United States would bring everybody to secularism and assimilation, they convinced their students not to go. So that you had very few rabbis in the United States in this major tidal wave of people immigrating to the country. You have 5 million Jews and very few rabbis. So even though you have traditionalist Jews, they now have to fit into the establishment in the United States. The establishment in the United States is predominantly Reform, as far as the synagogues are concerned, which they call temples. And then you have the newly found conservative movement, which really gets its start with this new immigration. What was the conservative movement? Let me show you something else, and I'll just, oh wait, no, I have to do it like this. I mentioned last time, and it's mentioned here too, conservative movement in the United States, which is sometimes called the Masorti Judaism outside of the United States, I'm jumping over, regards itself as the heir of Rabbi Zechariah Frankel, 19th century positive historical school in Europe. I mentioned this last time. Zechariah Frankel was actually in the same class as Abraham Geiger, the founder of the Reform movement, and also knew Samuel Raphael Hirsch, who was the founder of modern Orthodoxy in Germany. Frankel was open to modernity, but he thought that the Reform movement had gone too far. And even though he shared their feeling of the importance of academic study and being open-minded towards issues in modernity, he felt that red lines had to be drawn as far as practice and theology. So in a sense, the conservative movement, which will be found in the United States, saw Frankel as their ideological patron. Frankel does not move to the United States. The beginning of the conservative movement is the establishment of the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York City, ATS, which is established at the end of the 19th century. And I don't see the year here. I don't know why it doesn't say that. It was established at the end of the 19th century. The beginning was established as an academy of study of Torah for open-minded Jewish scholars. What happens is, by the early 20th century, they bring over Professor Solomon Schechter, who I mentioned last time. Professor Solomon Schechter was born in Romanian Moldova. I don't remember what city. If you want, you can look it up on Wikipedia. He was in Oxford University in London because he had found the Cairo Geniza and was heading the research of the Cairo Geniza documents, which are kept to this day in the Oxford Bodleian archive in Oxford. And he was asked to come to New York to lead the new Jewish Theological Seminary, since he was both Orthodox and scholarly and open-minded, and which he did. What he did was he changed around the structure of the seminary. If it before was just a study house of Torah, he created classes. He created a degree that you could take in Hebrew letters, an MA degree, a BA and an MA degree, and of course it had, of course, a rabbinical school where he would graduate rabbis who spoke English, which was not usual in those days in the United States, because most Jews were speaking Yiddish still. Remember, Yiddish was the lingua franca of the average Jew living in the United States, to such an extent that if you look up Yiddish newspapers in the United States in the Wikipedia, there are probably more than 20 Yiddish newspapers, daily newspapers in the United States at the beginning of the 20th century, because that's what the Jews were able to read. Their children knew English, but very often the parents, if they spoke English, it was not well. So they needed the Yiddish newspaper. They needed to know what was going on in the outside world. This was a difficult time to be an immigrant in the United States. There were no unions for workers. In fact, a lot of the unions created in the United States were created by Jews. So you got off the boat and you looked for a job. And as I said, if you didn't want to work on the Sabbath, you had to be a peddler, or something like my grandfather in New York was a peddler of clothing, sold on the streets, because only that way could you have the Sabbath off. Today in the United States, it's a 5-day work week, you get Saturday and Sunday off. In those days, you only had Sunday off. If you didn't go to work on Saturday, you were fired. There was no other option. So a lot of these Jews who came from traditional families from Eastern Europe, they just worked on Saturday because they had no choice. There was no unemployment insurance. None of these things existed at that time. So, and a lot of them worked in textiles, what we call in Yiddish the shmata business, textiles. And they used to refer to these factories as sweatshops because you came there early in the morning, left late at night, and it was really a very difficult thing to do. But many of the Jews worked in these sweatshop factories with fabrics because that was the only thing you could do if you didn't have language, if you didn't have degrees. Others tried to start their own businesses, like both my grandfathers, by the way. Both the one who came from the Crimea to Canada and the one who came from Lithuania to the United States. Both of them went into business so that they wouldn't have to work on the Sabbath. In fact, my Canadian grandfather eventually started a business in furs, and he was the first to close the doors of his business on Saturday, and he let off all the employees who were mostly not Jewish. Right? But the point was, I'm closed on Saturday. So yeah, that was quite something in those days. He came to Canada in 1917, just after the Russian Revolution. And he started the business already in the 20s, maybe in the 30s. Anyhow.
Where did he establish in Canada?
Montreal.
Okay. So you have
had
two
a lot of,
generations in Montreal.
Yeah, I know you were in Montreal. Yeah, sure. In Quebec, you had a lot of fur trappers. The Eskimos, the Métis, the half Eskimos, the half Indians. It was a very big business at the time. So my father opened up a store in fur coats, because it was a local business in Quebec. It was easy to do. Yeah. There's a lot to say about that, but it's not the topic. The French Canadians didn't go into business in those days because the Catholic Church was against business. They used to tell their people, stay at home, get married, have lots of children, and work on a farm. So all Quebec was farms. The problem is you can't have a whole system. Well, you could, but in a capitalist society, people want to have businesses. When the Jews came, it was wide open to start businesses because only the English were doing it, and the English were a very small proportion of the, not a very small, but a minority of the province at the time. So those who had the desire and the ability in going into business, any types of businesses at the time, really, it's a lot of interesting stories there. People I've met who've told me the stories, from my parents' generation. So very interesting stories at that time. Okay, so what happens is you have millions of Jews over that period of time who are from traditional backgrounds, who are interested in being connected to Judaism. They cannot relate to the Reform. They walk into the Reform synagogue, they see a rabbi who's not wearing a kippah, he's wearing the garbs of a Protestant minister, there's an organ, and they think, what is this? It's like, they can't, and to make it worse, the rabbi doesn't speak Yiddish. At the most, he knows German. So they don't go to the Reform. By the way, because of this, the Reform will change its platform in 1930. The Pittsburgh platform was a 50-year platform. From 1885 till 1935. 1935, there's a new platform where they're already more amenable to tradition. The new platform is tradition's okay. It's like, we're not saying no, we're just saying it's not an obligation, but they realize that the type of people who have come are different. But now becomes the heyday of the American conservative movement. You see, the American conservative movement was what we today would call modern Orthodox. These were Orthodox Jews who wanted to speak English, who wanted to become American, who wanted to be involved in American society. And the students of people like Solomon Schechter and all those who came to JTS were young people who were interested in Judaism, were a little bit afraid of the Eastern European rabbis who had come, who only spoke Yiddish and saw life as a continuation of the shtetl, of the villages that they came from. The new generation wanted something different, something which was more American. And the seminary gave them that answer. You could get a college degree while you were there. You could get a second college degree while you were there. They didn't have PhDs at the time. They wanted people who spoke English. They were going to send you to congregations where you would speak in English. And they would send you to congregations where the people were traditional, not necessarily 100% religious, because that's what Jewish life was looking like in the United States. The first generation might have been religious. By the second generation, it's already looking quite differently. That's something else I'll talk about. But that takes time. That's a process, right? Generations take a process. It's around. So what happens is that I would say in the 1920s, as early as the 1920s, but definitely by the 1940s, the conservative movement becomes the largest organized Jewish movement in the United States. It has a few hundred synagogues. I don't even know how many. Today, I don't know how many either. So it's like, you could find out maybe on their site, they say, but it was a very large organization, and it was trying to create an American-style Judaism. The Reform at that time was a little bit smaller, but it was catching up because there were a lot of Jews who had already distanced themselves from traditional Judaism, and some of them felt comfortable and conservative, and some of them were starting to feel comfortable in the Reform. The more Jews moved away from Judaism, the more they moved towards the Reform. When they move further away, they're not affiliated with any synagogue anymore, which is the situation today. But that's another, that's about half the Jews today in the United States. We're not affiliated with any synagogue. But at those times, you would start with conservative. Small groups were still, there were Orthodox synagogues. I'm not saying there weren't at all, but there were small synagogues, what we call in Yiddish Stiblach. Small houses, synagogues where, makeshift, open up, get an apartment or a basement somewhere and have a service for a certain amount of people. That basically were the Orthodox synagogues at that time. Now, two things are established at the end of the 19th century, which are going to change the course of the United States Jews. I'm focusing on the United States Jews because there are already 5 million people by 1930. Even though there are more than 5 million Jews in Europe, that's going to change after the war very soon. So it's obvious that the United States is going to be the next major center of Jews. And this is even before people know what the Nazis are planning. But it's a growing community. It's a community which is tolerating Jews. Okay, there are problems of not working on the Sabbath, but in other sense, Jews are equal citizens. In front of the courts, they're equal. It's not that there weren't problems. There was anti-Semitism in the United States. Albert Einstein, who came to the United States in the 1930s, writes to a friend of his that there's anti-Semitism in the United States, but he's dealing with it. Okay. That it wasn't, things changed, it takes time. When people come, especially they immigrate to the United States, they have the same ideas they had before. And the country itself, George Washington wanted the Jews to have rights, and maybe others do, but I'm saying you have the people. It takes time for the people to come around to ideas like this. I can give you other examples. After the Second World War, by the way, Hollywood was established by Jews in the 1920s. But for some reason, in the Museum of Hollywood, which was established in the United States by the money of Chaim Saban, a former Israelis, they took out the names of the Jews who established it. But Metro Goldwyn Mayer, both Goldwyn and Mayer were Jews. That's the rawr with the lion. Okay, I mean, that's just an example, but I mean, Hollywood was really mostly established by Jews because Jews were in the arts and Jews loved the theater. Look how many Jews you had in the Romanian theater. Jews love the theater, they love the arts, and it's a good way of running away from the problems of life. Being a comedian, being in the arts is a lovely way to run away the problems. So Jews love that. And Jews in the United States were just perpetuating this idea of cinema, theater, culture, and they established Hollywood. Hollywood today is taken over by many, many people. Now it's not just Hollywood anymore, because there's not just cinema. You have, a lot of private films that are made all over the world, and you don't really need to go to Hollywood Films anymore. So you have, what am I thinking of? Netflix and etc. So these are all private, HBO, whatever, all these private film companies. I have a cousin who was in a horror film, which I hate. I wanted to see the horror film, but I couldn't figure out where it was being shown because you have all these different possibilities today. Once upon a time, there was a theater, you went, but yeah. Anyhow, what can you do? So, so even though Hollywood was established by Jews, and Jews were very patriotic, in the Second World War, that Hollywood was authorized by the government to make movies about what the Allies are doing in Europe in the Second World War. And they did. There were many, many Hollywood films in order to bring the story home according to the way the government wanted to bring the story home, obviously. And they did so, they had no problem with that. And after the war, under McCarthy, in the McCarthy years in the United States in the 1950s, all these Jews were accused of being traitors and communists and whatever. So, I mean, those were the different times in the United States. I don't know if you know the story of the Rosenberg trial. What were their names? Rosenberg. It was the Rosenberg trial. Let's see if I can remember the names. Rosenberg. Okay. It was Julius and Ethel Rosenberg in 1953. Julius and Ethel Rosenberg had immigrated to the United States from the areas of Russia, I think as early as 1917. And they were accused of stealing the secrets of the atomic bomb from the Manhattan Project and giving it to the Russians. And they were executed in 1953 by an American court. They received capital punishment. They were killed by electrocution. But they didn't steal the secrets. We actually know today who did it. We know there was a fellow who was working in the Manhattan Project. The Manhattan Project was the project which was the name of the project where scientists were used from all over the world who were willing to come to the United States, some even from Germany, in order to create an atomic bomb, in order to, that the Americans called to end the war. Created new problems, but that was the Manhattan Project. You had within the Manhattan Project, Oppenheimer, who was a Jew working in the Manhattan Project. I mean, you had Niels Bohr, you had a lot of, however, what we found out after the fall of the former Soviet Union was that the Soviets actually received the information about the Manhattan Project from one of the guards, one of the security guards, who was actually a Russian citizen originally, and he was the one who gave. But obviously, the Rosenbergs had no way of getting to the Manhattan Project, and there was actually no way that they could have possibly known what was in it. And the truth is, most countries that have today nuclear bombs, they didn't need the United States for it. The information is quite open. It's really in any library. By that time, John F. Kennedy, who was the president of the United States, once said that the only reason that the Rosenbergs were executed was because the judge was Jewish. Unfortunately, there is something to that. Sometimes you want so much to show that you're patriotic that if somebody's accused of no, yeah. It's true, the Rosenbergs went to meetings of the Communist Party because people grew up in former Soviet Union under the communists. They thought communism was a good idea. That's all. They never met Stalin. The ones who came in 1917 never heard of Stalin. They only heard of Lenin, and they thought it was a good idea. So there were a lot of communists in the United States after 1917 until the war. And some of the communists created unions, by the way. So yeah, there were other people, anybody could have been chosen. Not a great story. But getting back to this. So because the conservative movement now becomes a movement which people can relate to. On the one hand, it's a movement in English, so they know that their children will feel, more comfortable in such a movement. Conservative movement at the time, by the way, the term conservative was taken from England because Schechter was in England, and in England, the Orthodox synagogues were called the conservative movement. Instead of using the term Orthodox, they called it conservative, meaning not liberal. You had liberal and conservative. In fact, the United Synagogue of England, which today is the Orthodox Synagogue, the conservatives in America call themselves the United Synagogue. They use the same term. So that the early conservative movement in the United States was really a modern Orthodox movement. Definitely until the 1940s, 1950s, not a question. Maybe the people were not so observant, but that's not unusual. But the rabbis were. There is a changeover in the 1970s. As the American populace becomes more assimilated in American society, moving away from religion, so the conservative movement becomes more accommodating. See, one of the things which I would say was different between the conservative movement and orthodoxy, were in a few areas. One was the need to social accommodation, to accommodate new issues that come up. Now, the conservative movement did take Jewish law seriously. They had what they called the Jewish Law Commission or committee, which would discuss things, but very often the committee would discuss how to slightly bend the law to accommodate to the new scenarios of American life. So for instance, the conservative movement had no problem with, by the 1980s, of having mixed pews with men and women sitting together. Then it became having women rabbis in the 1980s, and then it became women cantors, and a lot of issues, by the way, which had to do with the inclusion of women, which from a social point of view is a nice thing, but there are issues religiously which were not simple to overcome, and they slightly, to accommodate, they pushed the lines a little bit to be accommodating. The Reform never had a problem with these things, so they could do whatever they want. But the conservatives, which tried to keep within the fold of Jewish law, of halakha, for them, they had to make many compromises. By the 1980s, the conservative movement looked like it still was moving towards the Reform. And to this day, it's still like that. And then because the Reform movement took upon itself a certain amount of traditionalism in order to keep a Jewish sentiment. Remember, in the post-1970 United States, there is a movement towards religiosity and even religion, something that for years was not so. And because of that, it affected even the established religions. People wanted authenticity. Today in the United States, many people see Orthodox Judaism as more authentic, and that brought orthodoxy back to the fold in a large way. Now, there are many things to say here, but I'll try to do it in an organized fashion. So let me talk about first American Jews. I don't know how much it interests you, but I'll tell you anyhow. There's a paradigm that somebody created one time, which makes a lot of sense. If you remember, there are 4 sons in the Passover Haggadah. We have this book we read on Passover night. And in the book, aside from telling the story of the Exodus, we read the story of what's called the 4 sons. But I forgot to take names. I'm trying to be more organized. Okay, so let me just read off the names. Tell me if you're here, okay? Olivia is here, right?
Yes, I'm here.
And Mara Imran? Yes. And Nicoletta? Yes. And Lupa Joanna? I think so, yeah? Yes. And Roxaniela? Yes. That's Katrina, Roxania, yeah. And Eliana Valiku?
Aici. Present.
Okay. And Mirela Popovich? Yes. And Laura, yes. Claudia Filimon? Claudia? No. Olympia, I think I saw.
Here, sir.
Yes. Ramona Merk
I'm here.
Machalka? Okay,
I'm here.
very good.
Claudia was here early, but
Oh, Claudia was here?
don't know.
Okay, one moment.
At the beginning, I saw her.
Okay, that's okay. And Michaela Bakarna? Okay, Katrina Mercore?
Presento.
Okay, and Petruța Rotara? And Teodora Stoica?
Present. Thank you.
Okay, and Diana Stan? Diana here? Yes.
Yes, I'm here. Nipo.
Yes, and then Liana Nitescu?
Here I am. Here I
Okay,
am.
and Maria Bichescu? Okay, sometimes she looks in the tradition. Okay, and Liana. Oh, it's hard for me to read this.
Ileana Slujitoru, if it's
Yes, that looks like it. Where are you?
Here. Here.
Slujitori. Yeah, it's just a little hard to read it. Yes, Slujitori. Yes. Ileana. And
Professor.
okay, Ana Maria Puyu, is she here today? And Laura twice. Yeah. I don't know how that happened. Michaela Bakana also twice. How's that? Strange. Okay, Danielle Petenki. Daniela. Yes. And Corina Lang is here. And Madi Kitu. Madi. And Edgar. No, what's this? I don't know what that is. Okay, that's everybody, right?
Sorry. We are Claudia Contor and me. And Thea Haimovitz, we are three.
Roxaniela, I mentioned.
Yes.
And you said,
yes.
and Claudia,
We-
which one? Claudia?
Philemon.
Oh yeah, I wrote that already. Yes, somebody told me.
Yes,
Okay.
yes, we are together. And Thea Haimovitz.
And
Second.
Thea's there too?
Yes.
Okay, very good. Hello, Thea.
Sorry,
Okay.
and Rotaru Petruța.
I think I said that. One moment. I'm pretty sure I said that. Yes. Okay.
Okay, thank you.
So let's look at.
Monica
Okay, so let me try to explain this analogy.
Excuse me, I didn't hear my name. Sorry.
Monica?
Monica Serescu. I'm
Okay,
here.
let me check again. One moment. Okay, let's put it here. Monica Sterescu. Okay,
Thank you.
so let me explain this again. There are 4 generations. This model works very well for some reason. In the Passover Haggadah, there's a story about 4 sons. You have the wise son, the rebellious son, the simple son, and the son who does not know how to ask. Again, the wise son, the rebellious son. How do you say rebellious in Romanian?
Rebel.
Rebel.
Right. And then you have the simple son and the one who does not know how to ask. It says the wise son is asking all these questions. The rebellious son says, what do we need this ceremony for? Right? This burden. The simple son says, what is this? And the one who doesn't know how to ask doesn't ask a question. So somebody once said, this is a very good depiction of 4 generations of American Jews who came to the United States. The first generation is called the wise son, not because they're so intelligent, but they know a lot about the Jewish tradition because they grew up in religious families. Wherever it was, Russia, Poland, Austro-Hungary, wherever it might have been. And when they came to the United States, they were in a bit of shock because they realized they had to adapt to the new environment. They realized they had to learn English, which they did not know. Lots of things. I'll tell you a story. They tell the story after the war of a Hasidic community which comes to New York City. There are many communities like this who came after the war of immigrants. Also, after the Second World War, people came with the Yiddish language without English. So the story goes that one of the Hasidim decided this is America, have to make money, and he decided to open up a business. So his business was in men's clothing. So he opens up a business in men's clothing, and he says, wait a second, I have to wear something impressive if I want to sell somebody a suit, right? How do you say a suit? A costume, they say in French. So he decided he's not going to wear the Hasidic garments with the long coat, and he bought himself a double-breasted suit with a nice red tie and a Sherlock Holmes hat and a pipe and red shoes. And he went into the store and he was selling suits in the store. On Shabbat, when he went to his Hasidic rabbi in Brooklyn, so he would wear his traditional Hasidic garb with the long kaftan, with the long black coat, and on Shabbat they wear a little furry hat. That's what he would do. After about a year, he was feeling really bad. He said, "This is wrong. They don't know what I look like in the store. I don't want to lie to them. I want them to know what I look like in the store." So he decided one day he's going to come on Shabbat wearing his double-breasted suit and his red tie and his red shoes and his Sherlock Holmes hat, of course, without the pipe because it is Shabbat. And he decided to do that. So he walks into the Hasidic synagogue, and all the Hasidim are going, "What's going on? Yaakov." So he walks right up to the Rebbe. And the Rebbe says, "Yaakov, what's going on?" He says, "Rebbe, I wanted you to know what I look like during the week." The Rebbe said, "But Yaakov, I knew the whole time what you looked like during the week. Everybody told me." So Yaakov says, "But Rebbe, why didn't you say anything then?" Rebbe said, "Because I thought you were trying to fool them, not us."
Very nice.
Yeah. Yeah. So, the first generation we call the wise son. This could also be understood with the generations that come right after the Second World War to the United States. The wise son, because they know everything about Judaism. They know about the synagogue. They know about the prayers. They know some of the traditions. They know some of the history. Remember, these were not the scholars because the scholars stayed back. The scholars were afraid to come to the United States. There were stories about, you can write even, there's the famous Yiddish Jewish writer, Shalom Aleichem, comes to the United States in the 1920s and is describing moving sidewalks, escalators, right? Things that they didn't have in Europe, especially not in Russia at the time. And of course, he's making a lot of jokes out of it, of American society. The Shalom Aleichem, I forget his actual name. Wow. Shalom Aleicham's actual name that was just his literary name, Shalom Aleichem. His actual name was
It's Shalom Nahumovich Rabinovich. Can you hear me? Shalom.
Yes, I can, but
Shalom Nahumovich.
It's not
Shalom Nahumovich Rabinovich.
Rabinovich. It's Shalom Rabinovich.
Yes, Nahumovich Rabinovich.
Well, Nahumovich could have been just because that was his father's name.
Yeah.
Shalom Rabinovich. Yeah. So, yeah. So he comes to the United States in the 1920s. By the way, when he came to the United States, he met Samuel Clemens, Mark Twain, in the early 20th century. And Clemens said to him, he says, "I understand that you're the Mark Twain of the Jews." Yeah. Twain, by the way, wrote a very interesting article called Concerning the Jews, if you ever have time to look at it. Yeah. So the first generation we'll call the wise son. But the first generation doesn't know why you keep the Sabbath or why you do this or why you do that, because they're not real scholars, but they just came from very traditional communities and they spoke Yiddish. The second generation of American Jews who are born in the United States, who are trying very hard to be American, because the United States had this idea of the melting pot. Everybody has to be American. Everybody has to eat hamburgers, hot dogs, pizza. It was a very strong American identity concept. It's about baseball, it's about pizza, it's about hot dogs and hamburgers. It's a very strong identification. And the Jews understood that. And the next generation really wanted to be American. They spoke English, they understood Yiddish, but never spoke it, except in private. They were a little embarrassed that their parents spoke English with such a heavy accent. They wanted to move away from the Jewish areas of the town to show that they were more established. They all wanted to be professionals, doctors, lawyers, accountants. Everybody wanted to be a doctor, a lawyer, accountant. You know, the story about this girl goes to her mother, says, "Mama, what do you think? Should I marry a doctor or should I marry a rabbi?" So the woman says, "Okay, let me put it this way. You marry a doctor, you can be cured for nothing. You marry a rabbi, you could be good for nothing." Which is also double entendre in English. Okay, I shouldn't tell English jokes. It's not your mother tongue. That's not fair. So anyhow, so the second generation we will call the rebellious son, because the second generation reacts. They really want to become American. They're willing to give up the traditions to a certain degree, sometimes to a great degree, because when they asked their parents, "Why are you doing this? Why are you doing this?" Parents didn't know. That's the way Jews always did it. They were not great scholars who studied philosophy and history and Bible, and they were just simple people. And the new generation wanted to be American, didn't want to be considered different. And since there was anti-Semitism in the United States, they really just wanted to feel like everybody else. So that second generation hides their Jewish identity. They're still marrying Jewish people because that's what their parents want. They're still eating gefilte fish and what we call Jewish food, even though it might not be kosher. By the way, that's the beginning of what they call kosher-style restaurants in the United States, where you can eat cholent and gefilte fish, but it happens to be not kosher. Jewish-style restaurants. And Jews are still, a lot of them living in the same areas at the time, but they're moving away. And sometimes they talk between themselves, by the way, in Yiddish, when they don't want the children to understand, because they're not going to teach the children Yiddish. You had a lot of that in the second generation. And so this the first and second generation will very often be part of the conservative movement. Then you have the third generation. I'm just tying that into what we were talking about before. The third generation I call the simple one. What is the simple son? The next generation are children who their grandparents were still alive until they were, let's say, 15. So they might have gone to the synagogue with their grandparents. Their parents didn't want to go to synagogue because that's backwards. That's what they did in Europe. That's not the United States. And in the old country. So the parents didn't go unless it was Yom Kippur, what we call the 3 times a year Jews. They come Rosh Hashanah, Jewish New Year's, Yom Kippur, and then of course, the first day of Passover, when there's Yizkor, when there's a memorial prayer. And that's it. Sometimes it's the last day. Or there are 3 times is the memorial prayer. So, but the new generation is because the one who does it, who is the simple one. So they saw Grandpa, but Grandpa passed away after their bar bat mitzvah, by the time they're 15. and grandpa's not around, and they'll ask their parents, what was the synagogue all about? What is the prayer book? What's that in the Bible? And the parents will say, it's not relevant for American culture. Sometimes the parents will send them to a Sunday school, an afternoon school to learn a little bit, not very much. So that new generation doesn't even see Jewish practice. That was the generation of the simple son. And then the fourth generation, which is then a generation of, let's say, about 20 years ago or 30 years ago, was a son who doesn't know how to ask, because his grandfather was a rebellious son who knew about Judaism but was not interested. And then his father didn't know for anything. His father had a bar mitzvah, that was about it. The son who doesn't know how to ask was not sent to a Jewish school. Maybe his grandfather was, maybe he wasn't. By the way, Jewish schools in the United States only start well after World War II. We're talking about like the 1960s. Maybe the end of the 50s. Before that, all you have is what they call Talmud Torah, Sunday classes, evening classes, that's it. If you have the time, and most children, they get tired after 5 o'clock. You go to school from 9 to 5, you don't feel like going to evening classes. So even if your parents push you there, you fall asleep. So they used to make a lot of jokes about these evening classes in the United States because, you know, the children didn't really have that much education there and they were very tired, but okay, that I'll tell another time. Okay, I'll tell one story. This father sends his child to the Sunday school. So this child starts going to the Sunday school, listening in. So the father says, okay, son, what did you learn in Sunday school? He says, okay, we learned about this thing, it's called the Exodus out of Egypt. I don't know where Egypt is, but that's where we left this place called Egypt. And what happened? Tell me about it. He says, you want to hear the whole thing? He says, yeah, tell me what they told you about the Exodus story from Egypt. Are you sure, Dad? He says, yeah. Okay, the boy says. There was this guy, his name was General Paro. Now, General Pharaoh had lots of slaves, and we were one of them too, a long time ago. But thankfully, after many years, we had this big general whose name was General Moses. General Moses was a really smart guy. So he had a plan of how to get these slaves away from General Pharaoh. And what was the plan? Oh, it was like this. He had all these guys for the army who knew how to make platoons and bridges. So they ran out of Egypt as quickly as they could. They came to the Red Sea. At the Red Sea, all these engineers were building these platoons, these makeshift bridges going across the Red Sea. And when they got to the other side, they stole all these aircraft. And as General Pharaoh was coming across, they sent in that aircraft and bombed those bridges. And that was the end of that Egyptian army. Father says, tell me, son, is that what they taught you in the Hebrew school about the Exodus story from Egypt? The boy says, Dad, not really. They told me something else. But if I were to tell you what they told me, you'd never believe it. That's the story of the Sunday school. Yeah. Okay. So let's get back to this. So the third generation, the fourth generation is the generation who knows nothing. This, unfortunately, today is the situation of American Jews. We even passed that. We're in the fifth generation, the one who doesn't show up to the Passover Seder. Remember, the four sons are at the Passover Seder in the book. The fifth one doesn't show up. So what happens is you have a steady assimilation of American Jews into the culture. Because of this, there are changes within American society. Now, I have to give you one more introduction before I explain how Orthodoxy surprisingly has a comeback in the United States, because based on what I told you now, you would think everything would have been gone. we only have 20 minutes left because I now give these talks just for an hour and a half. So in these 20 minutes, I'm going to tell you something not related to this directly, but related to what happens in general in the West and how it affected also the Jewish communities within the West. And I call it, if you've seen my book, A Jewish Faith in a Changing World, which is I have in Romanian, at the end I have an article, and it's called Why Mysticism is So Popular Today. So I'll just explain it in a nutshell. This is just general, not necessarily about the Jews. After the French Revolution, and remember the French Revolution was a revolution not only against the kings, Louis, and even the revolution against the kings, it's not clear that they wanted to oust the king from the Versailles Palace. Remember, the revolution was women asking for bread. And the answer was, let them eat cake. People didn't have food. When people don't have food, those are real rebellions. Those are not political rebellions. So when they stormed the palace in Versailles, it was just to talk to the king and the queen. That was all it was, but mob scenes can get out of control. The king was overthrown. And then, of course, you have, see if I can even remember the names, Robespierre, I can't remember the names if you can help me with the French Revolution. But anyhow, I'm sorry?
Robespierre.
Yes. And who else? Yeah, he's the one who's well known, the one who liked the guillotine. But what you have here, you have two things happening. It's the overcoming of the king and overcoming all the elements of power in France that the leadership felt were trying to control the people. And one of them was the Catholic Church. So you had the Lumière, the people who were now trying to present France as an intellectual society. The new god of France was the goddess of reason, of the intellect. And there was a real enmity towards religion and the church. You know, after the French Revolution, they actually tried to change the calendar because, you know, there's 7 days in a week. And 7 days of the week reminds people of the Bible. Let me explain to you why this is. Because you see, a day is 24 hours because it takes the earth 24 hours to come back to the same point vis-a-vis the sun, the soare. A month is 30 days, more or less, because it takes the luna, the moon, up 29 and a half, almost 30 days to go around the earth. A year is 365 days because it takes the earth 365 and a quarter days to go around the sun. But the fact that the week has 7 days is because in Genesis, it says that a week has 7 days. You understand? So after the revolution, they didn't like the fact that people still had 7 days weeks, and they decided a week would be 10 days. There would be 3 weeks in a month. And that way we would eradicate the biblical 7-day week. Unfortunately, it drove people crazy. They could not get used to it, and they had to abandon the project. But the first few months after the revolution, they tried to create a new concept of a month with 3 weeks, that every week had 10 days. A real attempt to eradicate anything that had to do with religion.
Based on what they try to do?
Based on the fact that the church controlled the land. And they saw the church as having too much power in France. And there was corruption, and there was, you could read the history. It's, you know, you had in France, you had a lot of this negativity at that time. You had, for instance, the famous physicist. Who am I thinking of? It'll come back to me. In the 19th century in France, not only there's a major movement away from religion, and then they also adopt, of course, the evolutionary ideas of, well, first you have Lamarck, then you have Charles Darwin, but specifically after Darwin's Origins of Species, there are those who use these ideas, like I was thinking of Laplace, in order to talk about a new way of the world was created. Why do you have to talk about a new way of the world being created? Because again, Genesis says God created the universe, and therefore you have to give people another possibility if you want to take them away from religion. So Pierre Laplace, who was a French physicist in the second half of the 19th century, when he was asked what is his opinion of Darwinian theory of evolution, and what is the place of God in such a theory? So Laplace says, I'm in no need of such hypotheses. Okay, this almost scientific arrogance was a real attempt to separate, to make France laïque, totally secular, because of the negativity that had been taken upon them in all the years under the church. I think even to this day, by the way, a lot of Western European countries are very, very secular. It all starts from the 19th century and then keeps going. Now, in the 19th century, the new religion was the religion of logic and rationality. And this was actually boosted because of the fact that science, which is the little child of human logic, was very, very successful. If you think of all the technological developments since 1850 until the First World War, or until the Second World War, it is mind-boggling. Mind-boggling means it's an enormous amount. You have the railroad, 1850. Then you have electricity, 1870s. Then you have the radio. Then you have the gramophone. Then you have the television. Then you have the automobile, the machina, the car. Then you have the airplane. All this from 1850 till 1920. If you lived during that time, you wouldn't be able to keep up. Well, all the changes, the world is changing. Then you have the printed newspaper, which is even before that, the middle of the 19th century. I mean, it's really mind-boggling the things that are happening. Even electricity goes from the road into the house. Then you have running water in houses. Then you have the refrigerator. And then you have the washing machine, things that we take for granted, okay? And the freezer, lots and lots of things. The world is changing at such a rapid way. In the world of biology, antibiotics, the discovery of radiation, the microscope, which showed all these bacteria and infection and what to do, right? Anyhow, so the amount of things that happen, most children died at the first half of the 19th century. By the second half of the 19th century, most children were living. So the world population boomed in the second half of the 19th century, especially towards the end of the 19th century. World population boomed because of the fact that medicine was able to save children, newborns. So you have then a situation that people see that science is really bringing whatever you need. Science becomes the new religion. Philosophy becomes passé, and the new religion becomes science. So making its way into the 20th century, people see secular life, scientific knowledge as the new way of looking at the world. And religion is from the Middle Ages. Who needs that? A lot of this is a major Western influence. It might have started in France. It makes its whole way from Western Europe into North America, into England, Australia, South Africa, etc. Three things change this. But every change in society happens slowly. The first one I call a theoretical change. No, theoretical changes, they affect people, but not that much. The first theoretical change was in philosophy. But I'm not going to talk about that. Let's talk about the one in physics. At the beginning of the 20th century, nuclear physics was described by Niels Bohr, famous nuclear scientist. He said, if you've studied nuclear physics and it doesn't completely puzzle you, then you haven't understood what it's talking about. Physics, all of a sudden, which was known as something which works by very specific formulations, as it was under Newtonian physics, all of a sudden was looking at things in a very different way. There were questions that nuclear physics was asking about the world, which was not clear, even to the physicists themselves. I mean, they had theories. There's still theories about how things are working. But matter all of a sudden looked like very different than it looked in the 19th century. We always thought that matter was something tangible, like a table. This table is not moving, right? This house is not moving. I have to live in it. Along come the nuclear scientists and say, well, it looks like it's not moving, but if you really saw it under a really powerful microscope, really all the molecules are moving. Where are they going? No, they're not going anywhere. They're just moving very rapidly. They're moving. How come I don't see it? You can't see it. Your eye's not able to see it. You need a really powerful microscope to see that. Well, which way are they moving? Well, it depends. If you push it, you push the table, it's pushing back at you in the molecular level. That's why your hand doesn't go through. What's that? Okay. Nuclear physics is a way of looking at the world, which the average person can't think that way, because or else we wouldn't be able to live in the world. Did you know that if you took a simple hydrogen atom, which has only one electron and one proton in the nucleus, and if you were to enlarge it to the size of the head of a pin, how do you say a pin?
Huck.
So the size of the head of the pin, the first electron, which was orbiting the nucleus, would be at the other side of Bucharest. Most of the atom is just empty electromagnetic field. You have an electron going around a nucleus, but most of it is empty space. And the mass of the atom is just the nucleus. You could take, theoretically, all of planet Earth, theoretically. If you could get rid of all the spaces within the atoms, all of planet Earth would fit into 1 meter cubed. So where is the material of this world? Albert Einstein proved that not only is mass can turn into energy and energy can turn into mass. So even that 1 meter cubed is actually energy. It just looks like mass, but it can be transformed into energy. If I take a piece of wood and I burn it, it doesn't disappear. It becomes heat energy. Still there. It's called the law of the conservation of energy. Doesn't go anywhere. So what happened was that nuclear physics was asking a lot of unusual questions about the world, which made the world sound much more non-mechanic and non-physical I'm not going to use the word spiritual because that's too far, but non-mechanical. It didn't sound like the Newtonian world anymore. It had laws, but the laws worked a little bit differently. But as I said, these things are mind-boggling, but they only influence the intellectuals. At that point, they don't influence the people. The people, they see they have a radio, they have a machina, they can go fly places in an airplane. That's fine. What does it matter what the physicists are saying? We don't understand them anyhow. So that I call is part one. Part two is World War I. World War I is the first war in which the new technology is being deployed in the form of artillery, long-range cannons, artilleria. World War I is a war of artilleria. What was discovered in World War I is that millions of people died. In the history of war, we don't have wars where in 4 years, millions of people died on a battlefield because the technology was not that advanced for millions of people to die on a battlefield. But in World War I, they had the technology. So a war that started off because all the great empires were greedy. Everybody wanted land. The Austro-Hungarian Empire wanted land, and the Prussian Empire wanted land, and the Russian Empire wanted land, and the Ottoman Empire wanted land. The end result of the war we know. The Ottoman Empire disappeared. The Prussian Empire disappeared. The Austro-Hungarian Empire disappeared. And millions of people died. I think it was 4 to 5 million. The shock of World War I was that the new technology not only prolonged life and found ideas for disease and how to cure them, but also made it easier to kill people. It was what we call in English the Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde syndrome. That what we thought was a Dr. Jekyll helping society became a scary monster called Mr. Hyde, a monstru, which could also kill people in amounts that nobody knew how to do before. What's the saving grace of World War I is that the English used antibiotics against bacterial disease in World War I for the first time, and then it became used in all the hospitals around the world. That was the saving grace of World War I, a new medicine that could prolong life. But World War I was a shock of what new technology can actually do. You had planes and you had long-range artillery, and it was very scary. But that's not the end of the story, because when you make one point, okay, people get over it, life goes back to normal, and hakol, as we say in Hebrew, hakol b'seder, everything's back to normal. But then comes along World War II. And in World War II, in the center of scientific development in a country like Germany, all of a sudden you have a war which is so technologically advanced, with the panzered armored tanks and the Luftwaffe, which is a new type of quick airplane that can bomb England by flying over the channel, in addition to long-range artillery, which can now go much more kilometers than they could in World War I, with mobile units of artillery at the same time, and bombs that can knock out whole houses one after another. The Americans took down the city of Dresden just in not too many days. And then, if that's not bad enough, the discovery of the atomic bomb, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, people got scared. The Cold War, which develops right after that between the United States and the Soviet Union, creates real panic, real fear. Has science and technology unleashed the monster? Is this what's going to happen from now on? We'll kill more people than we help? Because in World War II, it wasn't 5 million who died anymore. It was about 60 million. And even tyrants were using the new technology to kill people. Stalin, and in China, Mao Zedong, both of whom outdid Hitler. Stalin killed about over 60 million people. I think Mao Zedong about 80 million people of their own people. That's what the new technology can do. People were really afraid. In those early years of the Cold War in the 1960s, you have a rebellion in all the Western democracies. The rebellion was the youth. Those children who were born just after the war and were now teenagers in the early 1960s, they were the hippies and the yippies. I don't know if you remember that movement. It's called the hippies and the yippies. It was anti-establishment. We don't want the establishment that was established by our parents' generation. We don't want the governments. We don't want the police. We don't want the universities. We want to go back to nature. We want love and not war. This was a reaction to the generation of their parents, which brought them into a nuclear standout with the Soviet Union. It's subliminal, it's a fear. Fears can pass, so sort of. All these hippies of the make love and no war and the free love generation of the 1960s and the early 70s, later on they all became businessmen on Wall Street, went to universities, etc., and became very much like their parents. But that episode was a real episode. There is a sociologist by the name of Ben David, originally Israeli, who wrote that there is a breaking point which happens around 1970. This breaking point is a loss of faith in science, which happens in North American society and in other places too. When this new generation realizes that until now science was solving our problems, but it looks like at this point science is now creating our problems. It's not that people aren't evil, but science is making it easier to be evil. And all of a sudden, in the 1970s and the early 80s, there is a renewed interest in Eastern religions, in Buddhism, in African cultures, in everything that the West thought was barbarian. Universities are studying Eastern culture and all different Aboriginal cultures. People are talking about doing yoga studies, and people are adopting Buddhism and ideas of Buddhism and doing transcendental meditation. And then you have these cults like the Moonies and the Krishna, and I'm trying to think all the names of the cults that existed during the 1970s and 1980s, large cults that make their way in the United States, in Canada, in England, and other places where people are coming from the East selling their goods to a generation which wants to learn about spirituality, a generation which is afraid that science is just teaching us technology, but we might destroy ourselves as human beings. And maybe there's something else to know about being a human being, which is aside from science. So the first thing is this spiritual movement that happens in the 70s and the 80s. It is a naive movement, and it is abused by all different charlatans who come in with selling their goods. But the next step after that spiritual movement, which also becomes a movement of interest in Kabbalah, by the way, and all different types of mysticism, becomes also a movement back towards organized religion by the 1980s, where organized religion also starts becoming back in the fold because people say, science is not giving me everything I want. I want to understand what the other options are, whether it's spirituality, whether it's religion, whether it's God, whether it's etc. So I'm saying that by the 1970s, in these countries, in the developed countries, there is a certain coming of age and asking more serious questions about things of the non-material world. So what happened as hypotheses within the scientific communities of the 1920s and 1930s, and then hit home with the fears of World War I and World War II, became a certain coming of age by the 70s and 80s, not just a rebellion, but a way of looking at life different ways. This affects the Jewish community as well. Because within the Jewish community as well, people start asking questions. Does Judaism have anything to offer modern man? And this becomes the what I call the upsurgence of what I call modern Orthodoxy and Orthodoxy in the United States. But I don't have time to talk about the today. So next week, what I want to talk about is, I'm going to go back to the 19th century, talk about the ultra-Orthodox in the 19th century, what we call the Haredi world, and the modern Orthodox, which starts in 19th century and in the 20th century, and how they make their way up till today. Somebody wanted to ask a question, I think, yes?